Very warm welcome to our GEM School webinar titled In a Time of Pandemic, Inequality and Climate Change, Zacchaeus Tax and Jubilee Now. And this webinar is co-organized by the World Council of Churches, the World Communion of Reformed Churches, the Lutheran World Federation, and the Council for World Mission, as part of the new International Financial and Economic Architecture Initiative. My name is Athena Peralta. I work as Program Executive for Economic and Ecological Justice at the World Council of Churches. And before I say anything more, I will just quickly hand over to my colleague Philip from WCRC, who will share some of the ground rules. I'm sure all of us are familiar with these ground rules already, but there's no harm in hearing them again. So Philip, could you guide us?
Yes, thank you so much, Athena, and welcome everyone to the second webinar that is part of the GEM School, but that we are opening to the public. It is in a webinar format. That means to all the participants, you can hear and see the panelists, but they cannot hear or see you. If you would like to ask a question, may we ask that you type your question in the question and answer box, and at the end of the session, Athena will assign questions to the different panelists as they may be. I hope that you have a good time of learning, and that this will be an enjoyable experience. Thank you once more for attending this webinar.
Thank you so much, Philip. So this webinar will explore how taxation, reparation, and debt cancellation could contribute to shaping an economy of life in the current landscape marked by the COVID-19 pandemic, gaping and widening socioeconomic inequalities, and a burgeoning climate emergency. And so we will have a short video on the Zacchaeus Tax campaign, and this will then be followed by a panel presentation, after which we will have time for Q&A as well as comments. So I hand over again to Philip for the video on the Zac Tax.
I'm Justin Thacker. I'm the director of the UK-based Church Action for Tax Justice, and I'm here to tell you about the Zacchaeus Tax campaign. Now, Jesus transformed many lives in his time, but one of those he turned upside down was that of Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus was part of an exploitative economic system that effectively stole from the poor and gave the money to the rich and powerful. It helped keep the rich rich while making the poor even poorer. But then he met Jesus and his life was changed, saying that he would give half his possessions to the poor and pay back 4 times the amount he had taken from anyone. The Zacchaeus Tax campaign is looking to see a similar transformation in the global economic architecture. For that economic system has been unjustly exploiting the poor for centuries. During the colonial period, millions of pounds were stolen and up to 15 million people from Africa were forcibly traded. Climate change, which has been primarily caused by countries in the global north, has caused huge loss of life and livelihoods across the poorer parts of the world. And our large international corporations, well, they're failing to pay the taxes they owe in the poorer countries, up to as much as $400 billion a year. That is 3 times the amount that is given in aid. Therefore, the Zacchaeus Tax campaign is calling for a transformation in the global economic system, a transformation that would, like Zacchaeus, return at least some of the monies that are owed. We want to see the creation of a reparation fund based on a global wealth tax that would address to some extent the colonial legacy and the costs of climate change adaptations. We want to see a change in the global tax rules That means large corporations start complying with their tax responsibilities, especially in the global south, and pay their fair share of tax to those countries rather than stash their wealth in tax havens. And more than ever, we want to see a fairer world, a more just world, a more equal world, a world where the rich and powerful stop exploiting and indeed stealing from the poor. We really hope that you'll join us in the Zacchaeus Tax campaign. Thank you very much.
We will now begin our panel presentation. Our first speaker is Reverend James Bagwen. James is from Fiji. He currently serves as the General Secretary of the Pacific Conference of Churches. He is a longtime activist for climate justice and the denuclearization of the Pacific. He is a minister of the Methodist Church in Fiji, a crew member of the iconic traditional sailing canoe Utoniyalo, and he's also a PhD student at the University of South Pacific's Department of History and Politics. And James will share with us what the concept of Jubilee means in the Pacific and why it is extremely urgent to have debt cancellation for climate vulnerable and heavily indebted small island states in the Pacific. And James, warm welcome to you. And I know it's really, really early in Fiji. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Athena. Yeah, it's early or late, depending on which side, which way you look at it. It's 1 o'clock in the morning here in Fiji, but that's okay. In the old days, I would still be in a nightclub somewhere. But it is a pleasure, and I bring greetings to you from our sisters and brothers across the Pacific, representing possibly 1/3 of the world's surface. And it's a pleasure to be able to share with you some thoughts from our Pacific community. I really perhaps would just like to say that in the context of the conversation today, it was interesting listening to the call for reparations around colonialism. Here in the Pacific, of course, we have experienced colonialism. We had the impact of different types of labor trade. We had the blackbirding of indigenous Melanesians from the Solomon Islands and Vanuatu to Australia, and that is now moved into a modern version of that with what we know as the seasonal worker scheme and the Pacific labor scheme. We also had indentured labor, laborers brought from India to Fiji. One of the interesting things also is that for us in the Pacific, colonialism is not a thing of the past. Here in the Pacific, we still have a number of Pacific Island communities that are still colonies and are moving towards or seeking independence and self-determination. That includes French Polynesia, which we call Maui Nui, that's the indigenous name for French-occupied Polynesia, and Kanaki, also known as New Caledonia. And I ask you all to remember Kanaki, New Caledonia in your prayers as they go for a second referendum on independence on October the 4th, the feast day of St. Francis. Where to begin? The context of Jubilee. And I mean, I think we are all aware of the issue or the context of Jubilee for us biblically, of course, from the journey of the Israelites as they went through their exodus. And in the biblical book of Leviticus, the Jubilee year occurs every 50th year, slaves and prisoners freed, debts forgiven, and the mercies of God particularly manifest. And of course, this is also intrinsically connected with the land. the freeing not only of people, but freeing of the land. And this is an interesting thing for us to think about. We've had globally, in the very early days of COVID-19, there were stories of the respite that the land and oceans and rivers and even air received as a result of lockdowns. And it showed what was possible if humankind allowed the earth to experience a Sabbath or a Jubilee. Here in the Pacific, we are often reminded of the Western model of development, which is based on domination and extraction. And we've seen what happens when people forget that the ecosystem is a system whose elements interact with their surroundings. We see what happens when the ecology is separated from economics, from ecumenism, the spirituality. And in the Pacific, we as churches, academic organizations, indigenous communities are working to establish an ecological framework for development that envisions what an economy would look like if it was to be based on well-being rather than economic development, based on leaving our ecological values intact rather than extracting them. I'll come to that perhaps a little bit later. But I would like to focus very briefly, and I'm mindful of our time this morning or this afternoon, on the issue of climate change, because that's probably the most pressing thing for us in the Pacific, especially as we've now been advised that we're going through a La Nina system. And it's interesting, in the past, when people talk about the weather, it was something that you used to, as conversation. Here in the Pacific, the weather is serious business for us because we're not just talking about the theory of climate change. We're not talking about climate change as something that is happening in the future. This is something that is our lived reality for a number of decades now and is starting to impact the way in which we envisage what is going to happen to our communities in the future. And when I was reflecting on the issue of Jubilee and the freedom of slaves and the right for people to return to their homelands on the year of Jubilee, it's interesting in the context of geopolitics, Pacific Island countries and other island states around the world are almost slaves to the geopolitical issues that are currently taking place. In the context of that, the Pacific is being lumped with, and all due respect to our friends from Asia, we are being lumped in an Asia-Pacific model in the context of the geopolitical challenges between China, Australia for us in the Pacific, Indonesia, and the US, Japan, etc. We are now being put into what's now known as the Indo-Pacific. So all these great demarcations that are being made by the neo-colonial powers, and we have really no say in that. Recently, I think it was on August 22nd, we reached Earth Overshoot Day. And that is the day in which we come to how much renewable energy or how much in terms of the resources that the Earth can sustain in 1 year. So by August this year, the 22nd, we had reached that. And the Pacific, again, was used within the Asia-Pacific framework of our footprint, our carbon footprint, our energy footprint. And someone remarked to me, we're always being lumped in these footprints when we're not even the little toe in this context. Being released as a symbol of Jubilee is very important in the context of three key areas when we come to climate change. One, of course, is climate financing. And that refers to not only adaptation, the way in which our island states are able to adapt to climate change, rising sea levels, the issue of ocean acidification, the issue of extreme weather patterns. For us in this region, the Category 5 cyclone is now the new norm. And how do we build resilience around these sorts of things while we are being kept dependent? Every time we need to rebuild a seawall, every time we need to repair a damaged road because of cyclones or rising sea levels, our countries are forced to take soft loans. These loans then start to add up, and we become stuck in a debt trap. And this is the challenge for us in the Pacific. We tend to almost be going cap in hand to seek the finance that we need to be able to cope with the sins of others in terms of climate change, in terms of carbon emissions. And the challenge for us now is in the context of climate-induced relocation, where we are starting to see already, even on the larger islands in the Pacific, people having to relocate to land that may not be their ancestral land. They will have to move to other people's land. They will have to move from coastal areas into urban areas. And then with countries like Kiribati and Tuvalu, there is the real talk of relocation from their island home, their nations, to other Pacific Island countries. Recently, we had a news article from about a think tank in Australia that is reviving the conversation around offering citizenship, offering work visas, offering residency in exchange for control of the exclusive economic zones of the vulnerable countries. So again, this is another form of slavery where you are forced to give up whatever rights you have as a sovereign nation in order to secure safety for your community. So as we look at the issue of climate financing, as we look at the issue of who pays for relocation, as we look at who pays for the survival of our Pacific communities and other vulnerable communities around the world that are vulnerable to climate change, the question of reparations is really around polluter pays. Who pays? And challenging the bigger countries, the large industrial countries, to pay for their carbon emissions. I think I'll leave it there and give others the opportunity to speak, and look forward to being able to share a little bit later on and answer questions. Naka, thank you.
Thank you so much, James, for really also expanding the notion of Jubilee to not just freeing of people, but also freeing of the land, and how these two are inextricably intertwined. I am now relieved to note that our second speaker is with us. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Manuel Montes. We call him Butch. Butch is originally from the Philippines. He currently works with the Society for International Development in the US, and he is a member of the Ecumenical Panel on a New International Financial and Economic Architecture. Previously, Butch was Senior Advisor at the South Center, Chief of Policy Analysis and Development at the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, Coordinator for Economic Studies at the East-West Center, and Associate Professor of Economics at the University of the Philippines. And Butch will reflect on why the Zacchaeus tax calls are especially urgent in light of current challenges posed by COVID-19 and climate change. So Butch, looking forward to hearing your input.
Good morning. It's my privilege to be able to speak to you about the Zacchaeus tax. I think, uh, and thanks for the very generous introduction, Athena. Are you going to be the one to show the PowerPoint, or should I be the one to do it? Okay, thanks. Yeah, okay. I can see it now. It is, in the case of the pandemic, sometimes some people ask, why should we be talking about taxes when people are losing jobs and the economies are tanking and things are going very badly in many economies? I think one answer to that question is, uh, hang on, I'm being bothered by this poll. Okay, anyway, let me talk. All right, so the Zacchaeus tax is about, has exposed the very large social divides in all our societies, in the poorest countries, among countries, in the richest countries. And the Zacchaeus tax has two main elements. One is called the tax justice element. I'm not sure I can see everything in the slide, Athena, but I guess if you press return, it will show the previous, okay, there's something wrong with the way I made the slide. So you have to keep on pressing return. Yes, before, okay, thanks. Okay, so there are two main issues with respect to the Zacchaeus tax. One is tax justice, and the other one is reparations. I expect my other colleagues will speak about the reparations. And what I'd like to do is really try to just explain why the Zacchaeus tax has these four particular elements, right? The pandemic actually tries to address, can I have the next slide, please? Yeah. The problem with the question of the very, very unequal distribution of wealth. I think you have to keep on pressing the return, Athena, because there's something, I couldn't change the animation of the slide, yeah, fast enough. We are living in a world in which high inequality is feeding higher inequality itself, right? Just when the pandemic started, a Forbes magazine reported that 600 billion of the richest Americans saw their wealth increase by 15% in March and April, right? So because what is happening is that the rich make money from their assets in the stock markets and by manipulating tax rules, right? There are some more elements, there are some more data that is shown here. There, for example, that the richest 1% of the world's wealth have as much wealth as $6.9 billion. And more scandalously, only 4% of every dollar of tax revenue comes from taxes on wealth. And in fact, this exemption from tax liability has been called by one IMF staff person as a question of false profits, right? Profits that are actually made by not paying taxes. So the next slide actually shows can you please press the slide one more time, Athena? Okay. This is a graph about household wealth. This is not the top 1%. This is and only in the United States, right? This is the top 0.1%. So it's the top 10% of the top 1%, right? Of the richest Americans. And it shows that in 2013, the richest top 0.1% had more than 20% of the wealth of all the households in the United States. Can we have the next slide, please? And this is, by the way, the top I'm using is stuff from I think that's Luke 19, right? The Zacchaeus story, right? This is Jesus asking to stay in Zacchaeus' house that day, right? So one of the proposals that has come up with respect to the wealth tax, and the first bullet point of the Zacchaeus tax is a wealth tax, is that if for wealth more than $50 million, there should be a 2% tax on wealth. That means that every year where your wealth is more than $50 million, you pay 2% per year. This is a proposal for the United States, actually. But it's something that all countries can consider in all of their countries. And if your wealth is more than 1 billion, it should be taxed at 3% per year, right? And it would actually raise quite a bit of money for the state. We also have a situation where capital gains taxes are very, very low, right? They're at 15%. If you're a salaried person in many countries, you're actually paying more than 28% or 25% of your income. And more than that, these taxes are going down very quickly on capital because countries are being forced to compete with each other to invite investment. Can I have the next slide, please? Thanks, Tina. Yeah. Okay. So the next bullet point of the Zacchaeus tax is to end tax evasion and avoidance. And here I'd just like to say what is the difference between tax evasion and tax avoidance? Well, evasion is crime. It's a crime, right? It is misdeclaration. It is smuggling. It is trafficking in drugs and people. Whereas avoidance is legal tax reduction. That means tax reduction that is legitimized by the kinds of rules that, for example, are favored by OECD countries. It allows the transfer of profits very easily between countries, right? And one of the most scandalous things about this is that it allows illicit financial flows to be facilitated, where 65% of the financial flows out of Africa has been estimated to be legal. That means avoidance by corporations. For example, if a mining company misdeclares its the value of its exports from a country, let's say like Zambia, right? Then it doesn't pay taxes on the exports that it made from the export of copper, right? The second thing is a lot of the profits of these corporations are kept in tax havens where they are beyond the reach of tax authorities. Can we have the next slide, please? And this is just a picture of the complex tax structures that are allowed by the current legal ways of avoiding taxes. So what the Zacchaeus tax effort is trying to do is to change the rules that are now making it completely legal for the rich and for international corporations to move their incomes out of the reach of their own tax authorities. Can we have the next slide, please? The next slide is about the next part of the Zacchaeus tax, which is carbon and pollution taxes, right? What has actually happened is that the benefits of nature have been appropriated by the few through private property, slavery, and colonialism, right? Industrialized countries have emitted greenhouse gases, and greenhouse gases take 150 to 200 years to dissipate. This means that the extreme weather that we're experiencing comes out of the greenhouse gases that have been put into the atmosphere by the rich countries right now, right? And what the carbon tax proposal seeks to do is to reduce greenhouse emission activities and to raise taxes for healthcare, social progress, and redistribution. May we have the next slide, please? Yeah. And the last, I think the last part of the Zacchaeus tax is about financial transaction taxes. Financial transaction taxes are small taxes on the transfer of wealth, right? It has been estimated that a lot of the rich actually make a lot of money from stock markets. For example, there's a lot of money being made by hedge funds shorting the currencies of countries, right? And what is happening is that the external debt has been a mechanism for extracting wealth from poor countries, right? They end up accumulating a lot of wealth that do not cost anything to the creditors when the lending actually does not work, right? So financial transaction taxes also have this big advantage that it allows governments to know who is wealthy. It's very hard to get information on who is wealthy, but when these taxes are actually imposed, and some countries have it, like France had it for a long time. For a while back, Brazil had financial transaction taxes. They were able to know who were not paying enough taxes, but actually having a lot of financial transactions. Can we have the next slide, please? So these are the next slides. I will not explain them in a very detailed manner because I would just like to connect these to the illicit finance, to the pandemic responses, right? So we are suggesting to impose surcharges on illicit financial flow channels, right? And for developing countries to introduce capital controls, which are really what is important in terms of the wealthy corporations and the wealthy moving their capital in and out of the countries. And we should allow disallow the withdrawal of capital by foreign investors from developing countries. Let's have the next slide, please. And then we think that it's now time to impose a COVID tax surcharge on the rich and large multinationals. You know that in World War II, Franklin Delano Roosevelt actually proposed that there would be 100% tax rates on incomes of over 250,000 in the United States. That means if you earn more than, and this is because a lot of the rich are making money from producing weapons, right? He thought it was scandalous for the rich to make money out of the war effort, whereas people were trying to solve it, right? Can I have the next slide, please? And this is again the question of the financial transaction taxes. We hope that it can provide a payroll protection to low-income countries and provide income transfers. There is also, in the case of the US, there are freezes in rent and mortgage payments. And we want to make sure that the bailout of private companies happen only on conditions, preventing them from speculating in stock prices and giving bonuses to the managers. Can we have the next slide, please? So it is very important to understand that the state should begin investing heavily in the health and caring sector. And there must be an increase. This is another proposal in the economy of life proposal, the democratic control over money creation and the issuance of SDRs, right? We are hoping also to increase the social mandates, paid sick leave, occupational safety, and union organizing protections. State investment in adaptation and mitigation. This is the pages here are from the statement of the economy of life, right? The page numbers here. May I have the next slide, please? Okay, so this is just, I think there are just 2 more slides, right? So what the Zacchaeus Call asks the churches to study the issues around just taxation and the reparation for slavery and ecological debt through the lens of covenants that God calls us to each other and to the earth, right? Tax payments are actually investments in social progress. In the time of COVID-19, we know that it has exposed the big gaps in the economic systems, as I started in the beginning. There's a quote there at the bottom from Pope Francis, that as long as the problems of the poor are not radically solved by rejecting the absolute autonomy of markets and financial speculation, the structural causes of inequality, no matter what, will not solve any of the problems. Just think about the pandemic. As long as the poor keep on getting sick, the rich will not eventually be able to avoid catching the COVID-19. May I have the last, I think this is the last slide now. This is a slide that is quoted from this is a quotation from the the Economy of Life statement of 2012, right? And it says that unfortunately, a lot of the economic discussions are taking place in a particular paradigm that says the markets have to rule and private property is more important than all of our other moral considerations. And I think this is the last slide. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Butch, for exposing the vastly unjust international tax system that we have and how the Zacchaeus tax proposals aim to address this and how they are particularly critical for the task of building back a better post-COVID-19. It is now my pleasure to introduce our third panelist. Reverend Suzanne Membe Matale is from Zambia. She is a tax justice activist, a pastor, and a commissioner of the Independent Commission for the Reform of International Corporate Taxation, which is a group of global leaders that are who are calling for deep-seated changes in the international system of taxation. Previously, Suzanne was General Secretary of the Council of Churches in Zambia and served as chairperson of the Economic Justice Network of the Fellowship of Christian Councils in Southern Africa. Suzanne will reflect also on the Zacchaeus, the biblical Zacchaeus story, and how it is a clarion call for socioeconomic transformation. But Suzanne will also reflect on tax justice from her own context of Zambia. So, Suzanne, you have the floor.
Athena, unfortunately, Suzanne is having connectivity issues.
Okay.
You want to Iva, and I'm trying to get Suzanne back.
Okay. So, I will now introduce Iva as we wait for Suzanne to get connected. And Reverend Dr. Iva Caruthers is from the USA. She is the General Secretary of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference, which is a national interdenominational organization within the African American faith tradition that is focused on social justice issues. Formerly, she was a director of the Black Theology Project, and Iva has a long history of engagement in community development initiatives and social justice ministry. She is Professor Emeritus and former chairperson of the Sociology Department at the Northeastern Illinois University. And Iva will share about how reparations is an important tool for social and economic and ecological justice. So we look forward to hearing from you.
To everyone this morning in the United States, where I am located in Chicago, and good day and evening to everyone else. I pray God's grace and blessings upon each of us and our families during this very challenging time. I thank the panelists who are here with me. I'm learning so much, and I look forward to our continued journey together. Delighted to share this morning in this conversation and appreciate the way in which I think we are weaving this quilt for a greater understanding around which we can carry out our respective ministries. I want to provide several conceptual frameworks around which we must further study and some data points which support the situational analysis for why reparations. And then I want to end with what does reparations look like and the role of the church. Try and do all of that in 15 minutes. Ha ha ha. All analysis, though, is guided by questions and assumptions. And I think we need to think deeply about that, because if you ask the wrong questions or preclude certain assumptions, your answers, be they correct or wrong, don't really matter. So I would commend us to frame or interrogate several assumptions or questions as we think about environmental justice, taxation, and reparations. If I had to identify 3 relevant driving declarations that frame my views and the work of the Proctor Conference around reparatory justice and reparations, they would be as follows. James Cone's brilliant and prophetic words 20 plus years ago, in which he argued that, quote, connecting racism with the degradation of the earth is a much needed work. The poor bear an unequal burden for technological development while the rich reap most of the benefits. And this makes racism and poverty ecological issues. Secondly, I would ask us to understand that global institutionalization of white racism, notions of supremacy and exceptionalism, and the doctrine of discovery have, in theory and fact, led to a hierarchy of human value that assumes some people are more valuable. They have the right to be divinely favored and are certainly more capable to control the life chances and choices of others. It is this hierarchy of human value that we see manifested in the dominant theologies and public policies that we've already talked about that supported land theft of Native peoples, enslavement of African peoples, debt relief, and transfer of funds in economic downturns that serve the wealthy, and most currently, the vetting of who gets tested, treated, or access to a ventilator in the COVID-19 pandemic. And lastly, I would ask that we interrogate foundational principles of economics that inform the capacity to envision economies that are new, that can in fact reverse wealth disparities, that will reverse impoverishment and the dehumanization of the majority of humankind, beginning with the assumption that was normalized by University of Chicago economist Milton Friedman, that the priority of corporations must be shareholder profits over socially responsible or ethical investments. Now I want to turn to some data points to consider underscoring what we've already heard. I want to reiterate that my context is the United States, African American lens. But let's be clear, there is only one environment consisting of interrelated parts across the globe. The 1987 benchmark study of toxic waste and race in the US that was issued by the United Church of Christ under the leadership of Reverend Ben Chavis identified the extent to which there was grave disproportionality of African American communities and those other people of color, which were intentionally determined to be sites of waste disposal and polluting industrial facilities. The research that has continued subsequent to that 1987 research affirms the same. So today, 44% of the population are low income and 40% of the population are people of color that live within 1 mile of the most 100 toxic facilities in the United States, thereby impacting 1.6 million people. Now let's look at COVID-19. We know the virus itself does not discriminate. Its propagation within a society, however, that is steeped in structural racism and the reckless, uncoordinated response to the COVID-19 pandemic by this current administration has led to avoidable and unnecessary death that is wreaking havoc on Black communities. The US has surpassed over 6 million coronavirus cases and remains at the top of the global chart. And African Americans and Hispanic populations are impacted at a staggering alarm rate. I'm not going to bore you with the exact statistics, but let me just say in my city, Chicago, African Americans are 30% of the population, and yet we're close to 60% of the COVID-related deaths. So what COVID-19 has exposed is the deep underbelly of systems of racism, economic greed, and the denial of basic human rights. It has laid bare the values which undergird that. And we note that COVID-19 has raised the concern of further commodification of genomic information and therapies that exacerbate the racial divides in the US and the world. In the United States, this is getting played out day by day around the rush to create a vaccine before an election. In terms of impoverishment and wealth disparity, we've already heard a great deal about that wealth disparity. In the United States, there are 46 million people who receive food from charities, and that was before COVID. The median net wealth for white households in the United States is $171,000, contrasted with $17,000 for Black households. So when you connect all of these dots, we can see why just this month, Oxfam reported, and I would commend you to get this report, it's called Power, Profits, and the Pandemic. I just want to read you a few quotes from it. It says, on the other side of the pandemic divide, not everyone is suffering. Corporations are crashing in, amassing significant wealth to their shareholders, executives, and owners. The 4 big tech firms are expected to make together almost $27 billion more in the pandemic profits over what they had in the past. Billionaires have seen their net worth increase by $792 billion since the pandemic. And you distill that to juxtapose what they're gaining from what they appear to be donating, and we see that they are philanthropically donating less than 1%, in fact, 0.32% of their operating income. So what we know then is that Oxfam says that to level the playing field and prevent super profitable companies from manipulating their strength, these super profits that large companies derive not from hard work, but from this external event, COVID, will raise billions of dollars, which could be used in fresh revenue needed to begin again after the pandemic. In other words, to reset new economies are possible. So I'm saying that in short, the questions of land gentrification, space recolonization, increased wealth disparity, food shortages, potential for neo-eugenic practices in the age of this genomic age and geopolitical power shifts do not portend well for humankind. And this brings me to the question of why reparations. Reparations because we need an intentional program to reset, remember reparatory justice undergirded by theological, ethical, and political defenses and policies is the only way to address the injustice. Reparations is a process to remember, to repair, to restore, to rejoin, replenish, to set right, to make amends and reconcile. And always, let us be clear, true reparations is a matter of justice. It is about healing. Of its own soul and vital force, the church is called to raise up and repair the breach, to be an agent of reparations. Martin Luther King made it very clear before he died in his book, Why We Can't Wait. There is no amount of gold that can provide the adequate compensation for the enslavement of the Negro American, but a price could be placed on unpaid wages. And so in the US, the American reparations, African American reparations movement has been committed to affirming the humanity of people of African descent and the healing of those communities from transgenerational, and I underscore that, transgenerational enslavement, oppression, and trauma. It is continuing, as James has already said. I suggest to you that for the church, we must see and embrace reparations as an opportunity for a moral cleansing and a reckoning in the US, which needs as a whole to search for its moral compass to guide it through these times and to survive what we are now facing in terms of the structural economic disparities that appear to be aided and abetted by an authoritarian Oval Office regime which seems to believe in a hierarchy of human value. On the legal side, we are guided by the principle of unjust enrichment. That is, in terms of reparation, if one party becomes enriched as a result of the wrong done by another, the law compels the beneficiaries to make adjustments, thus reparations. Now in the US, we have going on since actually 1989, a bill in Congress called HR House Resolution 40, which was a demand for reparations, i.e. to study the consequences of slavery, which has been updated to now become a demand for remedy. Let us find those remedies of reparatory justice, which can rectify this situation. The National African American Reparations Commission, I'm proud to be a commissioner, has developed a 10-point program for such a reparations program. And I would commend you to look at the National African American Reparations Commission 10-point program. It's very parallel to the CARICOM 10-point program for reparatory justice. In my last few minutes, I want to raise the question then of what can the church do? there is much. The church can seek to counter the self-complacency and silent complicity that has been evident transgenerationally over centuries. The church can contribute to reset the economic and cultural equation that can dismantle these systems that are interlocking. The church can qualitatively, spiritually, and quantitatively, that is financially, repair the breach by using its moral agency to do so in influencing policymakers. And the church can become a safe and liberated space that facilitates theological imagination towards the envisioning of a new world. And in fact, that's what we have to do. We've got to mitigate these notions that it is not possible to create new kinds of economies that are grounded in justice. All the time I get the question, so what does this justice look like? Well, the justice looks like concrete remedies. In the United States, there are now 200 plus municipalities who are actually identifying remedies and models for reparations. Justice looks like acknowledging the interconnected case for debt forgiveness from the continued global tentacles of the consequences of US and European historical reach and rape of nations of people in terms of neo-colonialism that we've talked about. And in short, justice looks like the establishment of a Marshall Plan that we were able to figure out and envision, a Marshall Plan that is global. Justice and reparations looks like atonement, an acknowledgement of the sin for crimes against humanity, a pledge not to repeat those crimes, and to get over the mentality and fear of people of color in the global imagination. The Zacchaeus Tax campaign for me in the United States could be amplified by the faith community shining light and truth upon Wall Street. Let us remember that Wall Street is both the site of global capitalism today, but it is also the site where a mass grave of unknown enslaved Africans was found. It provides a real and symbolic location of encounter with capital and corporate interests that need to be reminded of the Zacchaeus story and the voices of the disinherited, whose stories and histories and communities, bodies and struggles still await the justice of reparation and restoration. Thank you all, and may God bless us all as we together move on behalf of the so many who suffer daily in the midst of God's giving us enough. Blessings.
Thank you so much, Iva, for bringing a powerful racial lens to this discussion and for making a really passionate and compelling case for reparations as restoration, reparations as reconciliation, and reparations as healing of relationships, including economic and ecological relationships. Really, thank you. But in the meantime, while we get more of those in, I would like our panelists who reflected on reparations. So I'm posing this question to both James and also to Iva. If you could explain further what the connection is between reparations and Jubilee and debt cancellation. If you could deepen our understanding on this, I'd be grateful. So, James, would you like to start, and again reflecting from your context?
Thank you, Athena. I'll give it a shot. Just as Eva was talking, I was reflecting on another issue of reparations here in the Pacific, and that is around the legacy of the nuclear testing that took place from the end of the Second World War to as recently as 1996. and the number of nuclear tests that took place in again in Maunganui, French-occupied Polynesia, in Christmas or Christmati in the island, one of the islands in Kiribati, in the Marshall Islands, and in Australia as well as other places like Alaska, etc. The impact of these forced tests, which really forced people to participate in the test, to work on sites. People were not relocated from places where the bombs were being tested. And even to this day, the issue of the leak of uranium and radioactive waste from the former test sites into the ocean. We hear that the excuse me, the Mururoa Atoll, where many of the tests were done in French Polynesia, Maunganui, is on the verge of cracking, and that will release even more radioactive waste into the ocean. And the challenge around getting reparations for the victims and their descendants. We have second, third generation now descendants of those test veterans, as they're called, still struggling for reparations. People have died, and we still have that challenge. In terms of Jubilee, one of the things that we're also looking at when we look at the unjust economics, and I'm very grateful for the correlation between racism and poverty and the ecological impact that was raised by Eva. Here in the Pacific, as I mentioned, we're looking at rethinking or changing the narrative around development. And that is, instead of looking at gross domestic products as the wealth of a country, looking at well-being as an indicator of development. So it's not about how much money, because that is also a false, there is a fallacy that the GDP shows how good a country is doing economically, especially when you have huge inequality around wealth. But looking at well-being, which is quality of life for both humans and for the environment. And that's something that we in the Pacific are trying to promote. We have at least 2 countries in the region that have started to actively look at that. And we are developing frameworks around ecological development to put well-being ahead. And asking ourselves this question of, can Jubilee, in terms of rest for the land, because we have a lot of extractive industries taking place still in the Pacific, and now they're moving into the ocean under the guise of the blue economy. They are looking at deep sea mining. They're looking at extracting the so-called wealth of the ocean, again, for the benefit of whom? And so how do we address these things? I think the challenge for debt cancellation is a very big one, because I see in the current geopolitical context that there are some major countries that are, particularly in the case of here in the Pacific with China, where as I referred to the debt trap, it's being used as a way of moving into particular countries. And saying, for example, okay, if you can't pay your loans back, give us land. And then that will start to affect the safety and security of our Pacific countries and other developing countries around the world. I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Athena.
I would just add to that I think there are 2 things that the church in particular needs to consider. One is our unique positioning to make the moral case and to use our agency as it relates to ethical understandings and remedies. And the second is the power of language. And so one of the things I would suggest, James, that we figure out how to do, and Butch and Philip and Peter and Athena, is how do we think differently about what it means to even acknowledge that this is a debt? Absolutely, it's about the naming of it as a debt, giving us the kinds of forced loans that were the decision we had to make in terms of future survival or taking out a loan. And so those who were the victim just engaged in and were pulled into another reinvention of a system of enslavement or oppression. So that in terms of American history, the slave masters got the reparations from the federal government taxes, right? Because they, quote, lost property. Mm-hmm. You have already talked about the ways in which debts are being paid off from people who were already victimized by the land theft. And now we're arguing over how do we pay off the debt? Well, let's first begin with there is no debt. And this is also not about the salvation of the souls of the victim. It's about the salvation of you, like Zacchaeus, who were the perpetrators of the sin. And I think that that then takes us to having to think very deeply about how do we dismantle this notion of hierarchy of human value, that some people are more worthy than others to have access to a ventilator, to have access to a vaccine, to have access to this well-being that we've talked about. Even the notion of a gross national product, if you don't now factor in the extraction that's coming out of it over time, then you have a false, a mythical view of your well-offness, right? And so I think we have to begin with some real fundamentals in terms of the concepts we even use to discuss where we go from here in terms of building these new economies. And all of that is the opportunity that the church has, I think, to speak to it in terms that no other, quote, discipline can speak to it.
Thank you so much, James and Iva. And there is a related question before I pose a question to Butch. There is a related question on whether reparations is something that can be raised at the international level, in the arena of the United Nations. And there is also a question on the role of the churches in terms of their own in terms of their own lifestyles, in terms of their own operations, because churches too have been implicit in this system of enslavement. And how can churches also do or make reparations? So there have been questions to this end. So would either of you want to respond to that? And then I will pose a series of questions more on tax. So how can churches acknowledge their role and also make into reparations? Does anyone have some reflections on that?
Well, I can give a little. I think the first thing is to move into a commitment and a covenant to struggle with the truth. There's a lot of mythology that is attached to the creation of systems of dominion. That mythology is related to the theology and the sociology of how people have come to believe the lies that somehow this was divine will of God, that certain people are oppressed and their lands are taken and their labor extracted for the benefit of a few. I think what Butch has provided us with is the hardcore data of the extent to which not only the inequality exists, but the inequality is growing. And that level of inequality speaks to the need for the church to figure out, first of all, what was their role in all of this. From my historical context, there were ships that were named Jesus. There were slave ships that were named Mary. The church was very complicit. Church and state were hand in hand in the quest for lands to go in the name of God and conquer people. I mean, how do you say Columbus discovered America when you already have native people on the shore welcoming these people who have never been here? Are those people not people? We can go on and on. So the first thing I think is for there to be a confession. And then from that confession and that truth telling, churches need to look in terms of their denominational structures, but also their local context to find out what role they have played in the ongoing transgenerational oppression that has led us and is continuing to support this system of inequality and racism. And churches can do that, and it requires also for prophetic leadership and courage of church leaders to be willing to speak truth and to help people understand how their own sense of humanity would be served by their willingness to engage in this difficult work.
Thank you so much, Ida. James, would you want to add to that?
Sure. In the Pacific, we largely have indigenous churches now, and so it's really reflecting on our church heritage and our shared history, acknowledging the explicit, in some cases, and in other cases, implicit roles of the missionaries in some of these issues. The church, interestingly, in the Pacific, the church preceded, and in some places for many years was not part of colonization. But of course, as the two merged, we have some of these issues. But one of the things that's been quite interesting as a result of COVID-19, in the way that we've seen the responses from our churches working with their communities, and the idea again of Jubilee and the, I guess, debt cancellation at the grassroots level, when a number of churches across the Pacific have this year canceled the collections that the annual collections that they and fundraisings that they have as a result of COVID-19, recognizing that that many people are struggling. And you can imagine, we've talked about climate change and things like that here in the Pacific, but we are also an area that's heavily dependent on tourism. And with no flights, we have collapses of industries taking place. And so it's been really good to see a number of Pacific churches stepping up and saying, we will not burden our members this year, and allow them to focus on their communities and their families. So it's also thinking about the now as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, James. When we have a few questions as well for Butch, and one of them has to do with the story of Zacchaeus and how, whether indeed this is a story of conversion, particularly because of Zacchaeus asking about, posing the question, if I have defrauded. At the same time, we would like to take this opportunity to learn more about the proposed COVID-19 surcharge on the wealthy, whether this is gaining track among civil society organizations, but also whether this is a realistic advocacy call in the current scenario. So if you could help us with those questions, Butch.
Thank you very much. let me try to answer the first question first, right? Because Zacchaeus said, if I have defrauded, right? And therefore, it doesn't imply acceptance of injustice. I guess first of all, it is true that what we are looking for is just taxation, right? And in effect, Zacchaeus had this position as a tax collector. And he was not only a tax collector, he was a tax collector for a occupying power, right? For an imperial power. In effect, his whole job description, right, is a description of fraud, right? In effect, that the ability of a occupying power to collect resources to maintain the cost of occupation, right, was part of Zacchaeus' duties, right? And I guess for me, the question is, in that particular case, that is a question that is beyond Zacchaeus as a person, right? So it's a question of the whole system defrauding everybody else. And of course, Zacchaeus has his own role in that. And therefore, I think we must support just taxation, right? We must support just taxation. And we should be against defraud. And the way I read the text is to say that, well, Zacchaeus was only worried about his own personal defrauding, right? He wasn't worried that his own job itself was a defrauding kind of a job, right? And it is something that therefore you should think about. This all the reparations discussion allows us to really to open up this discussion about how these reparations can actually happen. Now, in the case of the call for a pandemic surcharge, right? I guess, well, first of all, the reason for the call is that many countries have, many private companies have made a lot of money, right, from the pandemic itself, right? Not only because the stock market values have gone up. I'm talking about Google and Amazon and all of these very large companies. All of them happen to be, all of the big ones happen to be American companies, right? Lenovo, I mean, selling more laptops because people are dependent on what we are actually doing right now, talking to each other using electronic meetings. So the first issue that has to be discussed is, yeah, okay, it's very important to actually, for society, given that the pandemic has caused a lot of tax losses, to be able to recover some of these costs. The problem that we have is that our global system is now actually still based on individual tax officials collecting the taxes, right? And in the case of these companies that are based in the US has actually been very, very casual about letting them make their money abroad and keeping it abroad, right? Keeping their monies abroad and doing it abroad. So what has actually happened is, even before the pandemic, countries were actually attempting to impose surcharges on not on the income, but on the operations of these companies in their own locality. So there's a very important conflict between France and the United States over taxing Google, right? Actually, Athena and Suzanne Matale are part of a group we call the International Corporate Independent Commission for the Reform of Corporate Taxation, that actually seeking to impose these rules by each country, if possible, right, in a decentralized way, to impose these kinds of taxes. And my view is that for countries that are having difficulty right now, they should try to impose these service taxes, these digital service taxes, in order to recover some of the revenues that they have lost. Of course, at the very end of it, there has to be a reckoning of it at the national level. And this is the kind of thing that ICRIT, which Athena and Susan are part of, to try to change the rules, right? So that corporations that operate internationally share their profits that they take out of every tax jurisdiction. So this is sometimes quite technical, but actually it is a matter of justice, which we are hoping that, with the churches all around the world, they can work with the local tax administrators to help them understand what they're actually losing with the kinds of rules that they're accepting from rich countries with regard to their with the way they treat the companies, international companies that they host in their own jurisdiction. So that's one thing that I think that the churches can campaign about and to discuss with the local tax authorities, because the only way to collect the taxes is not at the global level, but to collect it in each of the jurisdictions in which they operate.
You're muted, Athena.
Thank you. So thanks again to Butch. We have around 10 minutes left, and I don't think we will be able to address all of the questions remaining. And yet, I think it's important in this time to also share about a joint message that the convening organizations of this webinar issued last, I think it was last May, titled Calling for an Economy of Life in a Time of Pandemic. And in this message, we call upon leaders and the world at large, for instance, for international banks and financial institutions to cancel the external debts of low and middle income countries in the restorative and liberative spirit of Jubilee. And this is especially needed by countries in the global south so that they have the resources for building the resilience and rebuilding the livelihoods of people and communities. In this message, we also reiterate our call for the implementation of the Zacchaeus tax proposals. It closes, I think, with this powerful paragraph, and it says, the COVID-19 pandemic has laid bare the fact that we live together in a common economic, social, and ecological home. In our response to this global health crisis and the more colossal, longer-standing economic and ecological emergency, must recognize our intrinsic interdependence and hold together economic, social, and ecological objectives. And this calls for cooperation and solidarity within and across countries, embodied in networks of faith communities, civil society, and social movements, as well as fresh systems of global governance rooted in justice, care, and sustainability. And through such action and in that spirit, ways can be found if we are bold to root our systems, powers, and hearts, not in the old order, but in the new creation. And so in closing, I would like to invite our panelists for final words. We must hold together the calls for tax justice, the calls for reparation, the calls for debt cancellation. And for these are all marks of the way forward to an economy of life. So perhaps we can start with Butch, then then James, and I'm seeing that Suzanne is here. So so let me quickly change what I've just said. And I think we give this time for Suzanne to share, unfortunately, and not the allotted 15 minutes, but now 5 minutes. But I think it's important to give Suzanne a chance to speak. But it's lovely to see you, Suzanne. And you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Just unfortunate that all of a sudden I was disconnected. I tried all I could, but I'll see what I can say in the few moments that I've been given, hoping that by the end of my 5-minute presentation, people would have been inspired by this Zacchaeus story. because as far as I am concerned, I think this story of the book of 9:9 for me was a spiritual preparation for a time such as this. For us to get inspired by it, it may appear on the surface that it was targeted at an individual tax collector, but there is a moral story which is reinforced by Proverbs 11:1, which says, "The Lord detests the use of dishonest scales, but delights in accurate weights." I'm sorry, I don't have time, but I did this so nicely. Now I'll be jumping up and down. The story of Zacchaeus unravels the delinquency of the global taxation system in its current form. And it lays bare the fact that the systems are indeed oppressive, and in our language as faith people, sinful. And in the political circles, they call it corruption. And so the world needs to listen to this story, not only because it's a Christian story, but because it strongly speaks truth to power in a simple but a very fundamental and transformative way. The Zacchaeus campaign, spearheaded by the 4 organizations whom you already have heard about, successfully launched this campaign at the highest global platform, the United Nations in New York in July 2019, to give it a global status in order to encourage a global response, but also to announce to the world that first people have a duty and responsibility using their spiritual resource like the Zacchaeus story to raise their moral voices in all faith communities of the world. This campaign, in my view, is a clarion call to all people of the world to engage in an enabling transformative dialogue with political spaces, economic, corporate structures, and of course, starting with ourselves at grassroots through all levels, national, regional, because we need to raise our own consciousness for such a critical and important campaign, because it's about life and death in as far as I know it. Taxation, blood life of every nation, especially for us on this side of the world. Wow, so what do I leave out here? And now with the devastating, disruptive COVID-19, if we add it to climate change, it has become an urgent matter, requiring urgent solutions, which solutions require huge amounts of resources in order to combat the 2 enemies of the people now, coronavirus and climate change. Ordinary people like you and me have a right to know and to participate in this debate. It's no longer for the experts. It's for us, especially faith people, to ensure that we engage in a very meaningful way about bringing to the fore the importance of stopping the bleeding of our resources, the illicit financial flows. The battle or advocacy for change requires compelling arguments. Please, Athena, stop me when my 5 minutes is up.
You have 2 minutes.
Okay. The faith people, as faith people, we need to enforce our moral voice to promote ethical standards because we have a duty and a responsibility. I had a very nice story about Zambia, but of course I don't have the time. Let me just then conclude by saying that the Zacchaeus story is a wonderful resource that we can utilize to raise our voices, no matter how feeble, but put together, it becomes a strong voice to demand for equality, social justice, equal distribution of resources, and to stop this sin of stealing our resources. We, the people of faith, must feel the pain of poverty and inequality. Even if we ourselves live well, we have a duty of care for others. We are the ones whose churches in this part of the world I live in, who fill up our sanctuaries every Sunday, desperately looking for solutions to their condition. And it's for those that we need to arise and ensure change so that God can be given the glory he deserves. This is our Kairos moment. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Suzanne, and I'm sorry that we cut you short. And we would definitely love to hear the story of Zambia at some point. And I think we probably should record your story so that we can share it widely. With the minute that is left, I want to thank all our wonderful panelists for their very compelling and touching inputs. We are grateful for sharing your time and wisdom with us. And we would like to also invite you to our next public webinar, which is going to be happening around 2 weeks from now, October 2. And this time we will be exploring interfaith perspectives on just finance, debts, and reparations. I will hand over back actually to Suzanne for a very brief closing prayer.
Thank you, Athena. Shall we pray? Our Lord and our God, it's always a joy and a pleasure for us to discuss about these issues on behalf of your people. And so we thank you for this space. We thank you for the participants. And as we come to the end of this webinar, Father, I pray that you will unleash your blessings upon your people and upon all the participants. In the name of Jesus, we pray with thanksgiving from our hearts. Amen.
Amen.